The little girl approached the mogul and whispered, "Mom said I had to keep a big secret," which completely unsettled the wealthy man. But when she presented this item, the mogul immediately scooped her up and hurried away. In New York City, where skyscrapers often overshadow the sun, Arthur Sterling was considered a king without a crown. He was seated at his customary secluded table in the corner of Le Monarque, completely shielded from the external clamor by thick soundproofed glass panels. On the chilly marble surface, Arthur guided his costly fountain pen across a hefty stack of paperwork. It was the decision to wind down a subsidiary company that was underperforming. One swift, neat signature, and 500 employees would be receiving their termination notices the next morning. To Arthur, people were no different from figures on a financial statement. If they didn't generate a return, they had to be phased out. Marcus Arthur's chief of security stood with his arms crossed by the entrance to the VIP area. The imposing man with a faint mark tracing down his neck rarely spoke. He simply observed. The former operative's keen eyes scanned the busy flow of people battling the blizzard outside, then suddenly fixed on an anomaly. A tiny figure, clad in a tattered, faded pink winter jacket, was trying to squeeze through the gap of the revolving door, which was stuck due to the high winds. Lily slipped into the restaurant lobby, bringing with her the bone-chilling cold of a Manhattan winter. Her appearance was like a splash of ink on a flawless canvas. Her soaked, worn canvas shoes left dark, wet smudges on the polished floor, and the musty smell of her clothes immediately clashed sharply with the expensive perfumes of the affluent clientele. The restaurant manager frowned, signaling with his eyes to two waitstaff. They understood instantly and moved with smooth coordination, forming a pincer formation to block the unwanted visitor's path and safeguard the dining experience of their esteemed patrons. But Lily wasn't here to ask for handouts. She didn't hold out her hand, nor did she cower in fear. Seeing the two tall men approaching, Lily darted left, then threaded through the space between them with the nimbleness of a stray kitten accustomed to evading capture on the streets. Her gaze wasn't on the steaming hot plates of food. It was locked onto the man sitting alone in the glass-walled corner. The manager lost his patience. He took a long stride and reached out to gently take Lily by the shoulder before she could cause a distraction for their most important VIP. Arthur looked up. He raised a single index finger into the air. That small yet authoritative gesture seemed to freeze the entire room. The manager halted his hand, suspended mid-air, then quickly retreated, bowing apologetically. Arthur wasn't looking at him. He was staring intently at the smudged little girl standing before him. Her blue eyes were fixed on him unblinking. They were the spitting image of his own eyes when he looked in the mirror each morning. But instead of emptiness, they held a sense of profound unease he had never experienced. Arthur nodded slightly to Marcus. The massive security man immediately stepped aside, clearing the path for the girl. Lily walked up to the table, her quick breaths forming thin white puffs of vapor in the restaurant's warm air. Arthur set his pen down, expecting a plea or a usual tale of hardship. "Are you Arthur Sterling?" Her voice was shaky but clear, with none of the hesitation of a child seeking spare change. Arthur raised an eyebrow, leaning back into the soft leather chair. "I don't buy sweets, and this is not a charity spot, kiddo." Lily shook her head vigorously, the undissolved snowflakes in her messy blonde hair drifting onto her jacket shoulder. She reached into her pocket, clutching something as if it were a treasure. "I'm not selling anything. I heard people say you have a lot of money. You can get anything in the world, right?" "So?" Lily swallowed, trying to hold back the trembling that ran down her spine. She looked straight into Arthur's eyes, making an offer that stunned the cold mogul. "I have $2. I want to trade for a safe place." Arthur was silent, He looked into the painfully determined eyes of this 6-year-old, sensing a small crack had just formed on the icy wall around his heart. He was about to ask another question when Lily suddenly pulled herself inward, her face drained of color. She wasn't looking at him anymore. Her eyes were wide with concern, fixed on the area behind Arthur where the soundproofed glass separated them from the outside world. Arthur turned his head. Outside in the white snowstorm, a large woman heavily hooded was pressing her face against the glass. She was pounding on the window with both hands, her mouth yelling furious shouts that no one inside could hear. The persistent thumping against the glass behind Arthur continued like the insistent call of a bad dream demanding entry into reality. Arthur did not turn back. He simply nodded slightly toward Marcus. The security man understood immediately. With a decisive action, Marcus pulled the heavy velvet curtain completely concealing the large window. The silhouette of the agitated woman outside vanished behind the fabric, and the screaming was also silenced. The world inside Le Monarque returned to its inherent quietude, leaving only Lily's rapid breathing. Once the shadow was no longer visible, Lily released her grip from her head. She pulled out a worn plastic container from the ripped lining of her jacket. It was the kind of inexpensive food storage container people usually discard after one use, and the lid had a long crack. The little girl pushed the container, letting it slide across the slick marble table toward Arthur. "I don't have much, but this is all I can offer." Arthur looked at the container sitting awkwardly between the gleaming silver utensils. He opened the lid. Inside were no jewels. There were only 2 crumpled $1 bills rolled up like marbles, half a shattered cookie, and a Polaroid picture whose colors had faded with time. Arthur picked up the photo. Then his eyes widened and he stared at it in astonishment. The picture showed a young man smiling brightly under the eaves of a dilapidated wooden house, his arm around a blonde woman's waist. That was Arthur 7 years ago, and that woman was Sarah. Arthur's hand holding the photo began to tremble. He remembered that smile. He remembered the way Sarah always tilted her head when she looked at him. Seeing Arthur silent, Lily thought he was disappointed by the small offering. She quickly explained, her young voice trying to sound firm but full of fear. "Mrs. Vane said the man in the picture is the tower monster. She said you live up high so you don't have to deal with the smell of poor folks like me." Arthur looked up sharply, his gaze intensifying. "What did she say?" Lily took a small step back, her hands tightly twisting the hem of her shirt. "She said my mom was silly for loving you back then. You sent her away because she didn't have nice clothes. Mrs. Vane also said if you knew I was still around, you'd toss me in the trash." Every word from the child was like a sharp instrument going straight into Arthur's eardrum. Memories flooded back. 7 years ago, Arthur's father had thrown a stack of photos on his desk, showing Sarah meeting another man and claiming she took $1 million to leave him. Arthur believed it. He had let resentment freeze his heart for all those years, but this child and the vicious falsehoods Mrs. Vane had planted in her head. "Your mother would never walk away for money." Arthur blurted out, his voice hoarse. He realized the harsh truth. Sarah had left to protect the baby. She fled from his father, from the ruthlessness of the Sterling dynasty. Lily didn't understand what Arthur was muttering. She pulled up the sleeve of her jacket. On her thin, pale wrist were clearly visible faint marks in the shape of adult fingers. Some were already turning yellow while others were still deep purple. "Today she drank too many of those brown bottles and forgot to lock the basement. I got out." Lily looked down at her wrist, then back at Arthur. Her blue eyes were watery, but she held back the tears. "I brought the picture to give it back to you. I thought if I turned myself into the monster, maybe you'd stop being mad. You can keep me in your garage if you want. Just don't let Mrs. Vane take me back." That naive misunderstanding was more painful than any physical injury. His own daughter had been living through a terrible situation, believing her father was a vicious monster. And now she was standing before him, begging to be a compliant captive just for a safe spot. Arthur's self-regard was shattered. But immediately another emotion surged, more powerful and intense than all others. It was outrage. The fury of a father deprived of the right to love, the anger of a king realizing his kingdom had failed his own princess. Arthur shot up from his chair. With one decisive sweep of his arm, he sent the heavy marble table flying before him. The table crashed to the floor, crystal glasses shattered, porcelain pieces flew everywhere. The deafening noise silenced the entire restaurant. Diners were startled and the waitstaff were paralyzed. Arthur didn't care. He stepped over the mess, bent down, and lifted Lily in one strong arm. She was light, so light it made his heart ache. With his other hand, Arthur pulled out his phone. He dialed a number he never thought he would have to use in this situation. The moment the other end picked up Arthur's voice, cut through the night cold and sharp as a surgical blade. "James, activate the crisis handling team immediately. I want the top lawyers here in 5 minutes." The clattering sound of glass breaking on the polished stone floor had not yet subsided when Marcus positioned himself in front of Arthur like a human fortress. His gaze swept the room, his right hand resting casually inside the lapel of his suit jacket, ready for any scenario. Simultaneously, James's calm voice came through Arthur's earpiece, crisp and efficient. "The situation is noted. Team B is securing the back exit. Team C is managing building security. Local law enforcement will arrive in 5 minutes following a call about a public disturbance from the restaurant manager." "What are your orders?" "Arthur." Arthur looked down at the trembling child in his arms. Calling law enforcement now meant Lily would be placed into the social services system. She would become a case number in a file, and he would have to spend weeks, even months, fighting legally just to see his child. No, he couldn't let that happen. His authority wasn't meant to adhere to bureaucratic processes. It was meant to bend them to his will. "James, get in touch with the Sterling Foundation. Arrange a surprise inspection of the living situations of children receiving aid in that area. Reason reports of fund misuse. I want a team of investigators at Mrs. Vane's home within the hour. Ensure social workers are included." "Understood." A well-timed move. Arthur did not reply. He removed his expensive cashmere coat, gently wrapping it around Lily. The soft, warm fabric enveloped her small frame, concealing her ragged, dirty clothes. This act was more than just keeping her warm. It was an unspoken declaration, a mark of ownership. This child from this moment on belonged to his world. "Marcus will use the back way." The security team moved immediately. They formed a tight box formation with Arthur and Lily as the absolutely protected center. 4 tall, silent men in black suits moved in sync like a single machine. They glided through the restaurant kitchen, disregarding the astonished looks of the chefs and staff. The curious crowd in the main lobby with their raised phones would only capture photos of solid, broad backs. Lily snuggled into Arthur's arms, the warmth of the coat unable to dispel the fear in her eyes. She asked softly, her voice almost lost in the rapid footsteps. "Mister, am I going to get in trouble? I caused that glass to break." Arthur bent down, his mouth close to her ear. For the first time, he allowed a warm emotion to surface in his voice, and for the first time, he accepted the title he had rejected for 7 years. "No one will dare touch you. Your dad makes the rules here." The back door flew open. A cold night wind rushed in, but was immediately blocked by the glossy black body of the waiting Rolls-Royce Phantom. Marcus opened the car door. Arthur carefully placed Lily into the soft leather seat. She looked around, bewildered. The space inside the car was completely different from anything she had ever known. It was warm, quiet, and faintly smelled of expensive leather. A world in complete contrast to the dark, damp cellar she had just escaped from. The car glided away smoothly without a sound. Arthur looked through the one-way window. He saw Mrs. Vane stumbling out of the main entrance, her hair disheveled, her face contorted with fury and panic as she realized her golden goose had vanished. She looked around, then her frantic gaze fixed on the Rolls-Royce as it slowly drove off. Suddenly she grabbed something in her hand, rushing straight into the street, blocking the car's path. A thud rang out. Mrs. Vane had used an empty liquor bottle to smash hard onto the shining hood of the Rolls-Royce. "Help, he's taking my child! That mogul is taking my child!" She screamed her vicious false accusations, drawing the attention of a few passers-by, and ironically a patrol car that happened to be driving by. The car was forced to brake sharply. Due to the momentum, Lily was jerked forward and let out a shriek of fear. Arthur wrapped his arms tightly around the child, his eyes icy, looking straight at the woman screaming hysterically outside. He calmly instructed the driver, "Lock the doors, the game is on." The sudden jolt and Mrs. Vane's screams had drawn law enforcement and the crowd into the matter. How would the king of the tower use his own set of rules to turn the tables and protect Lily? Inside the luxurious space of Le Monarque restaurant, the Rolls-Royce Phantom was still idling outside the lobby. But Arthur Sterling was not in a hurry to step out yet. He sat down in the leather chair opposite Lily. The worn plastic container on the marble table looked like a ticking device. Lily put her small, trembling hands into the ripped lining inside her winter jacket. She pulled out something carefully wrapped in crumpled wax paper. It was her last treasure, the secret she had risked her safety to keep from Mrs. Vane's violent searches. "Mom told me to hold on to this. She said this was her heart." Lily placed the picture on the table. Arthur picked it up, his eyes fixed on the image of two young people smiling brightly under the eaves of an old wooden house. In the picture, Arthur looked younger, his eyes full of hope. He was embracing Sarah from behind. The detail that made Arthur feel a chill was Sarah's hands resting lightly on her stomach. The slightly protruding stomach under the thin dress was a detail Arthur had never known. "Your mother, was she expecting before she left?" Arthur wondered, his voice sounding distant in the quiet space. Lily looked at the picture, then into Arthur's wavering eyes. "Mom said that my grandfather, the man with the hawk eyes in Mom's other picture, came looking for her. He gave Mom a piece of paper with lots of zeros. He said if Mom didn't take the money and disappear, you would be in danger and I would never see the light of day." Arthur gripped the photo. Mr. Sterling, his father, an authoritarian figure who always considered his son's happiness a piece in the game of power. 7 years ago, he'd given Arthur a stack of fake photos claiming Sarah had taken $1 million to run off with another wealthy man. Arthur had believed the falsehood. He had spent 7 years harboring resentment, turning his heart into a block of ice. "My father said your mother took the money. He swore to me it was true." Lily shook her head, her blue eyes welling up, but she didn't let the tears fall. "Mom tore up that paper right in front of Grandpa. She said her love wasn't worth $1 million. She got away in the rain that night because Grandpa warned that he would make me vanish even before I was born. My mother got away from me, not for money." Arthur felt his chest crushed by a massive weight. This truth obliterated all the blind trust he had for his late father. It turned out Sarah had been fighting alone in the dark for 7 years. She had maintained her fierce will beneath that fragile exterior just to protect their child. "So where is your mother now? Why didn't she come to me herself?" Lily bowed her head, her hands twisting the ripped hem of her clothes. "Mom took a long sleep. She was so tired, she went to sleep in the charity hospital last winter. Before she went to sleep, she told me to find you, but not to tell you who I was right away. She was afraid you might be like Grandpa, that you'd look down on me because I didn't benefit your tower." Arthur closed his eyes. The image of Sarah alone in the charity hospital, her breath weak from illness, but still trying to remind her daughter to keep the secret, cut him to the core. "Who is Mrs. Vane? Why did she have you?" Lily looked up, fear plainly visible in her every movement. "Mrs. Vane is the landlady. After my mom went to sleep, she took all of Mom's papers. She hid the fact that Mom passed so she could still get the aid money every month. She said I was her savings account. If I got away, she would call law enforcement and say I was a thief." Arthur said nothing. He reached out his long fingers, accustomed only to signing multi-million-dollar contracts, now trembling as they touched Lily's thin cheek. He recognized Sarah's delicate features clearly on the child's face. These eyes, this nose, and even the stubbornness in her gaze, they were his own flesh and blood. Guilt surged, but immediately it transformed into an intense, powerful, protective instinct. The perpetual ice around the mogul's heart completely shattered. Arthur Sterling was no longer the lonely king of the glass towers. He was a father. "I will never let her lay a hand on you again. I give my word to Sarah." Arthur stood up. He didn't look at the mess of the marble table. He only looked at the trembling child before him. "Marcus, review all social services records and charities in this area. I want to know exactly how many times Mrs. Vane has used Sarah's name for illicit gain." Marcus took a step forward, his head slightly bowed. "I've had people start the tracking. James is handling the legal procedures to suspend all of her temporary custody." Arthur looked out the window. The world outside was still white with snow, but he felt a warmth beginning to spread from Lily's small hand as she timidly took hold of his finger. "Mister, are you really a monster?" Lily asked, her voice as soft as the wind. Arthur bent down, lifting her up. This time Lily didn't pull away. She rested her head on his shoulder, inhaling the scent of sandalwood on his expensive suit jacket. "Maybe I was a monster for leaving your mother and you alone, but from now on I will be your shelter." Arthur took long strides toward the main door. Every diner and staff member in the restaurant stepped aside. His power now came not only from money, but from a most primitive instinct protecting his lineage. Just as he reached the lobby, Marcus suddenly moved closer, the former operative's face tense. He put a hand to his earpiece, then whispered to Arthur. "The target has breached the security perimeter at the back alley. She's causing a disruption in the main lobby. She's accompanied by a few tabloid reporters." Arthur stopped short. He felt Lily clutching his collar tightly, her breathing becoming shallow and fast. Ahead, Mrs. Vane's screams began to reverberate, shattering the silence of the foyer. "They took her. Mogul Sterling took my daughter. Everyone look, he's using money to take the child from this poor mother." Flashbulbs from the reporters' cameras began to flicker continuously through the lobby glass door. Arthur tightened his embrace around Lily, shielding her face from the lenses. He looked at Marcus, his eyes razor sharp. "Get rid of the reporters. I don't want my daughter's face on any publication tomorrow morning." Marcus nodded, signaling for the security team in black suits to move forward, forming a human barrier to shield Arthur. And her. Arthur continued, walking, a cold smile appearing on his face. Let her finish this final act. The more of a scene she makes, the harsher her consequences will be. Arthur pushed the door open. The snow wind hit his face, but he didn't feel cold. Ahead was Mrs. Vane crying hysterically and the reporters swarming. The real challenge to reclaim Lily's life had just begun. He knew he had to face not only a greedy woman, but also public opinion and the shadow of the Sterling legacy. Lily let out a small cry when she saw Mrs. Vane rushing toward them. She brandished the empty liquor bottle, her face contorted by greed and resentment. Arthur did not retreat. He stood firm like a tower in a storm, waiting for the adversary to walk into his setup. "I dictate the rules in this game," Arthur whispered into Lily's ear as the patrol officer began to approach, looking baffled by the chaos. The quiet of the private room was interrupted by a furious, loud noise echoing from the main lobby, followed by the sound of things breaking and the astonished whispers of the diners. Arthur reacted immediately. The warmth that had just flickered when he touched his daughter's face was instantly replaced by a layer of icy resolve. He gently moved Lily behind him, using his large frame as a barrier. "Marcus, stay here with her." He didn't need to say more. Marcus nodded, moving to stand right in front of Lily, his eyes fixed on the door. Arthur stepped out of the private room. The scene before him was a calculated disruption. Mrs. Vane was standing in the center of Le Monarque's main lobby, bringing with her the cold of the snowstorm outside and the pungent smell of cheap liquor. She'd gotten past the security team at the main entrance by pretending to be a mother frantically searching for her child. But she didn't resort to violence. Instead, she began a well-orchestrated act. She collapsed onto the marble floor, her hands covering her face, and began to wail dramatically. "Where is my daughter? Has anyone seen my little girl? Poor thing, she's not well. She's confused. Please, everyone help me." The surrounding diners, who had been enjoying their meal in luxurious silence, began to pause. They looked at each other, then at the woman on the floor. Whispers arose. "Mrs." Vane looked up, her bloodshot eyes scanning the room until they stopped right where Arthur was standing. She pointed at him, her voice full of fake distress. "There he is. It's him, that terrible man lured my daughter. The girl often takes small items. He must have accused her of something and held her. Help me get my child." All eyes immediately turned toward Arthur, then glanced behind him where Lily was fearfully hiding behind Marcus. Their gaze was no longer just curiosity. It had shifted to suspicion, even judgment. A powerful mogul and a child in worn clothes, a distraught mother. The story seemed perfectly clear in their eyes. The restaurant manager, a bald man in a neat suit, rushed over. His face showed clear tension. Le Monarque's reputation was built on privacy and exclusivity. A situation like this was unacceptable. "Mr. Sterling," he said quietly, but his voice was full of urgency. "Please handle this discreetly. Perhaps you should return the child to her mother." The invisible pressure began to weigh heavily. Lily heard everything. "Take small items, confused, return to mother." Those words were like sharp implements aimed directly at her biggest fear. A reflex deeply ingrained after years of mistreatment took over. Lily slipped away from Marcus's protection, darting under a nearby marble table. She curled into a small ball, her hands covering her head, as if that action could shield her from the words and the punishment that was surely coming. Arthur saw the action. A sharp pain shot through his chest, more painful than any physical injury. He realized this was not the first time his daughter had had to do this. Her level of emotional impact was much more severe than he had realized. "Ah, there you are." Mrs. Vane had found Lily's hiding place. The act of distress ended instantly. She jumped up, rushing toward the table with surprising speed for her large frame. Her eyes were staring wildly, with no tears left, only vicious anger. Her crude, dirty hand reached out, grabbing Lily's hair, intending to drag the girl out before anyone could react. "You dare to run away!" She hissed, her voice low enough for only the nearest people to hear, but full of menace. "When we get home, I'll lock you in the dark cellar for the rats to gnaw your leg off." That statement, undeniable proof of abuse, reached Arthur's ears clearly. Mrs. Vane finally grabbed Lily's collar, pulling her forcefully out from under the table. In the middle of the luxurious restaurant, before dozens of staring eyes, she raised her calloused hand high, ready to deliver a disciplining hit to assert her authority. Lily squeezed her eyes shut, her entire body huddled, bracing for the familiar pain she had endured countless times. But the hit never came. Mrs. Vane's hand froze in midair, held tightly by a force as strong as a steel clamp. Arthur's hand was still gripping Mrs. Vane's wrist in midair. His long fingers, accustomed only to signing multi-million-dollar deals, were now hard as cold steel. He didn't need to use much strength, only to maintain the posture, his eyes fixed on the woman opposite, whose face was turning from red to purple. Let go. Mrs. Vane stammered, her previous aggression suddenly dissolving as she met Arthur's gaze. It was not the look of a person who was angry. It was the look of a force of nature, watching the one who dared to provoke it. There was no fire, only eternal coldness. Arthur shoved her hand away hard. A decisive force sent Mrs. Vane staggering backward, almost falling into the nearby dining table. "Marcus." Arthur called his trusted security man's name, his voice light, but carrying the weight of 1,000 pounds. That was all the cue needed. Marcus and his colleague stepped out of the shadows. They moved so quickly and professionally that the surrounding diners hadn't even had time to blink. Two strong arms locked onto Mrs. Vane, bending her arms behind her back. A small crack sound was heard, accompanied by the large woman's squeal of pain. "What are you doing?" Mrs. Vane shouted, struggling, but to no avail. The two security men held her like two large rocks, not allowing her to move an inch. Arthur didn't even glance at her. He turned back, bending down next to Lily. The girl was still trembling, her hands hugging her knees, eyes tightly shut, waiting for the strike that never came. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket, gently wiping away the streaks of tears on his daughter's cheek. "Open your eyes, Lily," Arthur whispered. "It's okay. She can't touch you anymore." Lily peeked open her eyes. She saw Mrs. Vane, the invincible monster in her world, being restrained, her face pressed against the wall. Then she looked up at Arthur. This man was so tall, and his eyes looking at her now were so warm, completely different from the coldness before. Arthur stood up straight, turning to face the entire restaurant, which was dead silent. He adjusted his cufflink, then looked directly at Mrs. Vane, being held tightly in the corner of the room. "Mrs. Vane," Arthur said, his voice echoing clearly with every word. "You can deceive social services, you can trick the neighbors, but you have just made the biggest mistake of your life by harming Arthur Sterling's daughter." That declaration was like a time bomb exploding in the room. Whispers erupted. Arthur Sterling's daughter. This child seeking spare change. Mrs. Vane heard this and let out a sneer. Her smile was crooked on her sagging face. "Who do you think you are, king of this place?" She strained her neck to argue, clinging to the last hope of the legal system. "I am her legal guardian. I have the paperwork. You are a stranger. You are taking a child. I will take you to court. I will call law enforcement. The law protects me, not wealthy, influential types like you." Child. She was sure of it. Over the years, she had slipped through countless inspections by social workers. She knew how to play the victim. Arthur did not argue. He didn't even seem bothered by the accusations. He simply quietly pulled out his phone, placed it on the nearest intact table, and turned on the speakerphone. "James, are you listening?" The other end echoed a deep, sharp, and cold voice, no less than Arthur's. It was Attorney James, the man nicknamed the Shadow Judge of the New York legal world. "I hear every word, Mr. Sterling, and Chief Miller is also on the line." Mrs. Vane's face changed color. The name Chief Miller was the fear of every offender in the city. Arthur crossed his arms over his chest, looking at Mrs. Vane like a mouse running in a maze with no exit. James informed her of her current situation. James's voice was firm through the speakerphone. "Mrs. Vane, we have just completed the review of your bank accounts. Over the past 7 years, you have received a total of $84,000 in aid money for Ms. Sarah and young Lily. However, medical records show you have never taken Lily for a routine checkup, not even once. Where did that money go? To Atlantic City establishments and liquor stores, correct?" "That's a lie. I spent the money to care for her." Mrs. Vane screamed, sweat starting to pour down her forehead. "Care," James chuckled softly on the phone. "We have just extracted data from the security camera of the convenience store across from your building. Over the past 30 days, the camera recorded you returning late at night in an intoxicated state 18 times. And more importantly, the camera in the back alley recorded young Lily being kept outside on the balcony in the snow all night the day before yesterday." The air in the restaurant seemed to freeze. The wealthy diners who had looked at Lily with suspicion moments ago now simultaneously turned to look at Mrs. Vane with absolute disgust. A woman wearing pearls at a nearby table gasped, "My goodness, the nerve!" Mrs. Vane was speechless. She never expected the cheap cameras in the slum to become her downfall. "That's not all," James added the final blow. "I have just sent this evidence to the court. An emergency order for her removal has been signed. Charges harm to a child, social welfare fraud, and unlawful confinement. Mrs. Vane, your time is up." Mrs. Vane collapsed. Her legs gave out and she couldn't stand needing the 2 security men to hold her up. The aggression vanished, leaving only the raw fear of someone who knew they were about to lose everything. "No, I was just guiding her." She mumbled, tears and snot running down her face. "Please, I cared for her. Without me, she would have passed long ago." Arthur stepped closer, bending down to meet her eye level. "You didn't care for the child," he said, his voice so low only she could hear. "You kept her, and now it's your turn to experience a real confinement." Siren sounds blared outside the glass door. Flashing blue and red lights reflected onto the crystal fragments on the floor, creating a chaotic yet artistic scene of consequences. 2 law enforcement officers walked in, followed by Marcus. They didn't need to ask much. The cold handcuffs immediately locked onto Mrs. Vane's wrists. The crowd in the restaurant, without being told, automatically parted, creating a path for law enforcement to escort the suspect. No one looked at Lily like a thief anymore. They looked at her with sympathy and at Arthur with respect mixed with caution. The king not only had money, he also held justice in his hands. Arthur turned to lift Lily. He wanted to take the child away from here quickly. But as she walked past Arthur, Mrs. Vane suddenly stopped. She raised her head, her bloodshot eyes no longer pleading, but instead filled with intense resentment. She gave a sinister smile, revealing her yellowed teeth. "You think this is over, Sterling?" Arthur frowned, signaling for law enforcement to stop for a moment. "You think I'm the only one who knows about this little girl?" She hissed, her voice hoarse. "Someone else is looking for her. I was just keeping her to make a little extra money, but he wants more than that." "What in the world are you talking about?" Arthur demanded. Mrs. Vane cackled, the sound like shattering glass. "He's my creditor, but he likes little companions like your daughter. He knows I'm out of the picture, so he'll come looking for her to collect my debt. He's 100 times more unsettling than me, Sterling. You better keep the child close." Law enforcement pulled her away, cutting off the wild laughter. The door closed, but her warning lingered in the air like a cloud of concern. Arthur tightened his embrace around Lily. The girl snuggled into the crook of his neck, trembling. "Don't listen to her," Arthur said, but inside an alarm bell was ringing. He realized that removing Mrs. Vane was only the beginning. Sarah's past and Lily's years of wandering held other unseen challenges that he did not yet know. And if anyone dared to seek his daughter... Arthur looked out at the snowstorm. His eyes darkened. "James," he said into the phone that was still on, "investigate all of that woman's contacts. Find the person she just mentioned. I want his name before sunrise." Mrs. Vane had been removed, but Lily's past challenges remained. Arthur decided to enter the dilapidated apartment himself to face the truth. What painful secrets were hidden under the stairs? The law enforcement car carrying Mrs. Vane faded around the corner, but Arthur did not watch it go. He turned back, his eyes growing colder as he looked at Attorney James. "Let's go. We're going to her apartment." "Are you sure law enforcement will handle the collection of materials? I want to see it with my own eyes. I need to know how the child lived." The old apartment building appeared before them, silent and decaying. The air inside the hallway was thick with the smell of mold and trash. The door to Mrs. Vane's apartment was ajar, and there was the sound of things being tossed around inside. Arthur's security team immediately moved ahead, shielding him. Arthur motioned for them to stop, then walked in. A large man was ransacking an old wardrobe. He turned, startled to see the group in black suits, but quickly regained his aggressive demeanor. "Who are you? Get out of here!" James stepped forward. "We are the legal representatives of the new owner. You are unlawfully present." The man let out a sneer. "Owner? That woman Vane owes me a lot of money. I came to take her little girl to settle the debt. Where is she?" Arthur didn't say a word. He just glanced at the security team. Two of them moved forward in sync. No need for tools, no need for warnings. Their presence, tall and solid as two mountains, was enough to make the creditor swallow. He backed away, his hands raised. All right, I'll go." He squeezed past them and rushed out. The door slammed shut, returning the suffocating silence to the room. Arthur looked around. Trash, dirty clothes, and empty bottles were scattered everywhere, but the mess didn't bother him. His eyes stopped at a hidden corner under the stairs. He walked over, kneeling down. It was a small niche in the wall, just enough for a child to curl up. Inside, there was only a torn, dirty, smelly mattress, and next to it a plastic bucket containing muddy water. Arthur reached out to touch the cold cement wall. In the weak light filtering in, he saw neatly carved marks scratched with fingernails, hundreds of parallel lines grouped into sets of 5. He turned to James, his voice almost a whisper. "James, is this where a child lived?" James did not answer, only silently looked at the soulless counted lines. His throat felt tight. Arthur took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He remembered Lily's instruction. He gently tapped on the creaking wooden floorboards right in front of the niche. One of them made a different sound. He carefully pried it open. Underneath was a small, almost completely rusted metal box. Arthur gently lifted it out, dusting off the layer of dirt clinging to it. His hand trembled slightly as he opened the latch. Inside, the first thing he saw was a worn, leather-bound diary. Next to it was a birth certificate. Mother's name, Sarah Miller. Child's name, Lily Miller. The father's name section was blank. Lying at the bottom was a stack of letters tied neatly with a pale blue ribbon. The letters were never sent. Arthur picked up the diary. He flipped through the yellowed pages, Sarah's handwriting appearing. He sat down on the dirty floor, reading eagerly. Today, Lily first said, "Mommy." The child smiled so brightly. "Arthur, I wish you were here to see it. I'm afraid of your father. He found me. He warned he would make sure I never see our child again if I tried to contact you. I have to move again. I can't let him find Lily. I'm afraid he will harm her. I'm also afraid you might be like him, afraid you will take the child from me. Lily asks about her father. I said something about you being an astronaut flying among the stars. What should I do, Arthur? I miss you, but my love for our child is greater than my fear. I will protect her at all costs." The words blurred before Arthur's eyes. Any remaining doubt in his mind vanished. This was not a false pretense. This was the truth. Every word from Sarah was a deep emotional impact to his heart, both painful and freeing. She never stopped loving him. She was only trying to protect their child. He carefully placed the diary back in the box along with the remaining items. He stood up, holding the box to his chest, as if it were the most precious treasure. As he stepped out the door, Arthur turned back to the assistant waiting outside. His voice was resolute without a hint of hesitation. "Acquire this entire building. Tonight, I want it leveled." He wanted to erase this difficult space forever so there would be no trace of Lily's painful days. Just then, Attorney James's phone rang. He answered and his expression changed quickly. He looked at Arthur, his face full of concern. "Arthur, there's an issue." "What is it?" "Mrs. Vane has obtained legal assistance, a very clever one. They just filed an emergency petition for custody. They claim we took the child and demand you return Lily immediately because we do not have official DNA results." The space inside the luxury car suddenly became tense after James's statement. Arthur did not flinch. He tightened his arms around Lily as if the lawyer's words were a tangible threat trying to intrude. "To Sterling Hospital, immediately." "But Arthur, according to procedure, law enforcement requires us to take the girl to a facility they designate to." "I don't care about their procedure." Arthur's voice cut across the air, cold and definitive. "To my hospital. No one, not even law enforcement, is allowed to approach the child until I give permission." The driver did not need a second command. The car glided through the night, leaving the wet streets behind. The private Sterling Hospital appeared, a towering structure of glass and steel, symbolizing the Sterling family's authority in the healthcare sector. As soon as the car stopped under the awning, a team of doctors, nurses, and security personnel were waiting. No explanations were needed. Arthur's command had been issued before the wheels stopped turning. At this moment, this was no longer a medical facility. It was a stronghold. An elderly nurse with a kind face gently received Lily. The girl was still drowsy, startled by the unfamiliar surroundings, but the nurse's warm arms and gentle voice somewhat reassured her. Arthur watched until the door to the special patient room closed. He turned around, and the firm emotional mask reappeared on his face. "James, contact Dr. Allister. I want him to personally conduct the DNA test. How long does the usual process take?" "At the fastest, 24 hours with a priority order." "I'm giving him 3 hours." James swallowed. 3 hours was a scientifically impossible request, but he knew that when the king of the tower gave an order, the impossible had to find a way to become possible. He nodded and pulled out his phone. Arthur walked out to the main waiting area. He sat down in a leather armchair, silently looking out at the huge glass wall where the snowflakes were falling more and more heavily. He was waiting. Not long after the main hospital door opened, a man in his 40s in a sleek suit accompanied by 2 law enforcement officers walked in. He looked around, then walked straight toward Arthur with a self-satisfied smile. "Mr. Sterling, it's a pleasure. I'm the legal representative for Mrs. Vane. My client, as the sole legal guardian of young Lily, demands that you return the child immediately. Your removal of the girl without her consent could result in a severe legal action." Arthur did not stand up. He didn't even look at the lawyer, his eyes still fixed on the snow outside. James stepped forward, standing between the two men. "Your client is in custody pending investigation for harm to a child and unauthorized use of funds. She is not in a position to demand anything." The lawyer let out a sneer. "Those are just unsubstantiated claims. A regrettable misunderstanding. Until the court makes an official decision, Mrs. Vane remains the guardian. We are simply following the law. Mr. Sterling here probably understands the importance of the law better than anyone, right?" Finally, Arthur turned his head. His eyes held no anger, only cold emptiness. He signaled to his assistant. A thick file was placed on the glass table between them. Arthur did not say a word, only flipped through the pages, letting the evidence speak for itself. "This is the transcript of a statement from a man named Tony Gallo, a loan shark. He stated that yesterday afternoon, Mrs. Vane proactively contacted him, offering to hand over Lily to him to settle a gambling debt." The smile on the lawyer's face froze. The two law enforcement officers accompanying him began to look at each other uncomfortably. Arthur turned to the next page, which contained clear photographs. "And this is where my daughter has lived for all these years. A niche under the stairs, damp with no light, with these marks scratched with fingernails to count the days." He pushed a photo toward the lawyer. The man glanced at it, then quickly looked away, not daring to look directly at the evidence of that cruelty. "With this evidence," James spoke, his voice firm, "we will not only demand permanent removal of custody, but also propose to pursue criminal charges against your client for unlawful transfer of a person harm and unlawful confinement of a child. These are particularly severe criminal charges. I'm not sure you want to associate your name with a situation like this." The lawyer's face turned pale. He was someone who exploited legal loopholes to make money, not a fool willing to ruin his career over a desperate past her prime individual. This was no longer a lucrative opportunity. It had become a deadly trap. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here. I need to re-engage with my client." He mumbled, not daring to look straight at Arthur. He turned around, signaling to the two law enforcement officers, and quickly walked away, almost fleeing the hospital lobby. The legal contention ended even faster than it began. James immediately made a phone call. "Hello, police department. We have new evidence in Mrs. Vane's case. Yes, I suggest elevating the warrant." Just then, Dr. Allister, a silver-haired man with an academic appearance, quickly walked toward them. In his hand, he held a carefully sealed envelope. The entire waiting area seemed to hold its breath. "Mr. Sterling, we have the findings." Arthur stood up. He took the envelope, his fingers always steady, now slightly trembling. He tore the seal, pulling out a single sheet of paper. His eyes scanned the complex scientific terms, looking for the final conclusion. Probability of biological father-child relationship, 99.999%. The air seemed to leave Arthur's lungs. 7 years of doubt, 7 years of regret, 7 years of emptiness, all decided by one number. He was her father. It was an undeniable truth. James silently placed another file and a fountain pen on the table. "Petition for custody and new birth certificate. Only your signature is needed, Arthur." Arthur took the pen. He looked down at the blank space on the birth certificate where the father's name section had been empty for 7 years. He took a deep breath, then put the pen down, writing his name there. Arthur Sterling. He finished signing, placing the pen down. An invisible weight he had carried for many years seemed to be lifted. When he walked into the patient room, Lily had been bathed by the nurses. She was wearing a light blue patient gown, looking small in the wide hospital bed. Her messy hair had been neatly brushed, revealing a high forehead and large round eyes, exactly like her mother's. She was sitting hugging a teddy bear, looking at him with eyes that were both curious and afraid. Arthur sat down in the chair next to the bed, trying to keep his voice gentle. "Are you feeling better?" Lily only nodded, still clinging tightly to the teddy bear. After a long moment, she finally spoke softly, a question that had haunted her young mind. "When I feel better, will you send me away?" Arthur felt a sharp pain in his heart. Mrs. Vane said, "Wealthy people don't keep those who don't contribute." That statement was like a final blow, breaking the icy wall Arthur had built around himself for 7 years. He pushed the food tray aside. He slowly walked closer to the bed, then gently embraced Lily's small, trembling body. For the first time since Sarah left, the Ice King showed emotion. His eyes moistened the child's hair. "I lost your mother and lost you once already," he whispered, his voice strained with emotion. "This time, even if the situation changes dramatically, I will never let go." Hearing the word "Dad," Lily paused for a moment. Then suddenly, she broke down, the suppressed sadness of all those years bursting out. Her small hands went up, hugging Arthur's neck. Acceptance and healing had begun. Arthur left the hospital with Lily. He carefully placed the girl in the back seat of the car, fastening her seatbelt. Outside, the snow had stopped. The night sky was clear, revealing the city lights. Arthur watched the scenery pass by the window. For the first time in 7 years, the world in his eyes was no longer a bleak gray. He felt a fragile yet real hope sprouting in his chest. He turned to look at Lily. She had fallen asleep from exhaustion, her head resting on his shoulder. He smiled a truly rare smile, but then his smile faded. He felt Lily's body heating up abnormally. Her breathing became shallow and fast. He placed his hand on her forehead, burning hot. Lily suddenly went limp in his arms. The high fever, a consequence of many days of hardship, and the harsh snowstorm had finally arrived. Home. Faster! Arthur's voice erupted, shattering the silence in the Rolls-Royce. The driver did not ask a single question, immediately turning the car, speeding through the night toward the Sterling Tower. The penthouse welcomed them with silence and soft yellow light. Arthur's private doctor, a middle-aged man, was already waiting. He quickly took Lily from Arthur's arms and brought the girl into one of the guest bedrooms. Arthur followed, feeling out of place in his own home. This was the first time a child had been here, in a space filled with angular sculptures and cold, abstract paintings. He stood by the bed watching the doctor work. Prolonged hardship and high fever due to cold exposure. Nothing life-threatening, but the child needs rest and to have her fever eased. The doctor handed Arthur a damp cloth. "You keep the cloth on her forehead for me, please." Arthur awkwardly took the cloth. He had never done this before. His hand, accustomed to signing billion-dollar contracts, was now clumsy as he placed the cloth on his daughter's small, hot forehead. In her delirium, Lily began to talk in her sleep. Broken whispers. "Mommy, I'm sorry. I only ate one cookie. Don't lock me up." Arthur's heart clenched. He motioned for the doctor to leave, then sat down by the bed. All his money, all his influence became meaningless before the deep pain in the child's past. He couldn't go back in time. He couldn't erase those difficult experiences. He stayed awake all night, holding Lily's tiny hand tightly, as if afraid that if he let go, she would vanish. At dawn, he called the housekeeper. "Remove all the sculptures from the living room. Replace all the stone flooring with carpet. I want this place to be safe." The next morning, the sun's rays shone through the huge glass wall, waking Lily. She slowly opened her eyes. The ceiling was soaring high, the bed as soft as a cloud. Outside the window, the whole city stretched out below. Lily anxiously sat up. Where was she? She pulled herself inward into a corner of the bed, her eyes wide with fear. Was she no longer here? Was this a better place? The room door gently opened. Arthur walked in holding a small food tray. He was wearing a simple sweater instead of his usual suit. Seeing Lily's fear, he did not approach. He placed the tray of porridge on the floor and sat down there at eye level with the child. "Good morning." Lily did not answer, only nodded. "I prepared some porridge. Would you like to eat a little?" He pushed the tray closer. The bowl of porridge looked a little clumsy with a few rice grains stuck to the side. Lily looked at the porridge, then back at Arthur. She was silent for a long moment, then timidly spoke. Her voice was clear but trembling, carrying a question that had haunted her for days. "When I feel better, will you send me away?" Arthur froze. Mrs. Vane said, "Wealthy people don't keep those who don't contribute." That statement was like a final hammer blow, shattering the icy wall Arthur had built around himself for 7 years. He pushed the food tray aside. He slowly moved closer to the bed, then gently embraced Lily's small, trembling body. For the first time since the day Sarah left, the Ice King showed emotion. His eyes moistened the child's hair. "I lost your mother and lost you once already," he whispered, his voice strained with emotion. "This time, even if the world shifts, I will never let go." Hearing the word, "Dad," Lily was startled for a moment. Then suddenly she cried loudly, the repressed sadness of all those years bursting out. Her small hands wrapped around Arthur's neck. The acceptance and healing had begun. 3 months later. The air in the Sterling Corporation's executive conference room was thick with tension. The chief financial officer, a bald man with 20 years of experience, was standing nervously before the massive projection screen. He was presenting a multi-$100 million merger with a European partner. Numbers danced on the charts, blue and red lines tangled, all pointing to a future of massive profit. But no one in the room dared to breathe deeply. All eyes were secretly glancing toward the black leather chairman's seat at the head of the table. Arthur Sterling sat there silent as a statue carved from stone. His finger tapped rhythmically on the glossy mahogany table. Tap, tap, tap. The steady, dry sound echoed amidst the gentle hum of the ventilation system. The CFO swallowed, trying to conclude his presentation. "And, Mr. Sterling, at this pace, we will finalize the signing at 4 p.m. this afternoon. This will be the biggest accomplishment of the quarter." Arthur stopped tapping. He looked up at the chart, then down at the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. He frowned. The entire conference room held its breath. They were all too familiar with that frown. It usually signaled a furious response, a termination, or a critique of competence. The CFO pulled out a handkerchief to wipe his sweaty forehead, bracing for the storm. Arthur stood up. The sound of the leather chair rubbing created a loud rustle that startled a few people. "Reschedule the signing for tomorrow." The room was bewildered. The CFO stammered. But sir, the partner flew in from London. Everything is ready. If we postpone, tell them to wait, or they can fly back and we'll find another partner." Arthur buttoned his suit jacket, his face expressionless. "I have something more important." "Something more important, sir?" Yes, it's time to pick up the princess from school. Arthur finished speaking, took his phone, and strode out of the conference room, leaving behind over 10 senior executives with their mouths agape. No one could believe their ears. The king of the tower, who once considered work his lifeblood, had just walked away from $1 million deal just to pick up his child. In the hallway, Anna, the secretary who used to fear Arthur, was waiting. Instead of her previous nervous demeanor, she smiled brightly, handing Arthur a small, carefully wrapped paper bag. "Your item, sir. I chose the exact artisanal chocolate Lily likes, and I canceled the dinner appointment with the senator." Arthur took the bag, nodding slightly. "Thank you, Anna. Well done. Have a pleasant afternoon, sir." Arthur stepped into his private elevator. As the metal door closed, he looked at his reflection in the shiny mirror. Still the perfectly tailored suit, still the angular, cold face, but his eyes were different. They were no longer the gray of ashes. They had focus. They had anticipation. The Rolls-Royce stopped in front of the gate of the city's most prestigious private elementary school. Unlike the gloom of the cold winter days 3 months ago, the sky today was clear and high. The trees lining both sides of the road had budded, covering the landscape in a fresh green color. Spring had truly arrived in New York. Arthur leaned against the car door, blending into the crowd of other parents. He no longer had a large security detail surrounding him. He was just a father waiting for his child. The school bell rang. The gate opened and a crowd of children poured out like a flock of birds taking flight. Arthur scanned the crowd, and he didn't take long to find her. Lily walked out. She was wearing a plaid dress uniform, her chestnut hair neatly braided on both sides. She was no longer the thin, dirt-smudged child shivering in an oversized coat from before. Her cheeks were plump and rosy, and her large eyes sparkled with confidence. She was laughing and talking with a friend next to her. Then Lily saw him. Her face lit up. "Dad," Lily shouted, leaving her friends running toward Arthur. She jumped up. Arthur, with reflexes that had become second nature over the past 3 months, opened his arms to receive his daughter, lifting the girl into the air and spinning her around. "How was school today?" "Great, I got an A in art. My teacher said I colored the sky beautifully." "Is that right? Then we'll have to hang it in the most important spot tonight." Arthur put Lily down, adjusted her uniform collar, then opened the car door. "The floor's yours, princess," Lily giggled, diving into the car. The car took the father and daughter back to the penthouse atop the Sterling Tower. The door opened, and the change inside the apartment was even more apparent than the change of seasons outside. The cold home in the clouds, once likened to a soulless art museum, had completely transformed. The sharp metal abstract sculptures had disappeared. Instead, there were fresh green potted plants placed in the corners of the room. The cold marble floor was covered with thick, soft, cream-colored rugs. On the huge glass wall overlooking the entire city, where it used to be empty now, were numerous scribbled crayon drawings. Crooked houses, purple trees, and stick figures holding hands. They were taped up with colored tape, looking entirely out of place amidst the $1 million decor, but they were the only things that gave the house a soul. On Arthur's vast desk next to the latest computer was an army of stuffed animals, bears, rabbits, and even a green dinosaur. The silver photo frame, previously always face down, was now upright, containing a clumsy selfie of the father and daughter. In the picture, Arthur was grimacing because Lily was pinching his cheek. Lily tossed her backpack onto the sofa, running straight to the dinosaur on her father's desk. "Mr. Dinosaur said he missed me all day." Arthur took off his coat and hung it on the chair, loosening his tie. He walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of orange juice, and brought it out to the living room. "Oh yeah, did Mr. Dinosaur remind you to wash your hands before your snack?" Lily cheekily stuck out her tongue, then scampered into the bathroom. As the sun began to set, painting the New York sky a vibrant orange, Arthur and Lily sat together on the soft rug by the large window. This was their daily routine, watching the sunset and talking about small things. Arthur watched his daughter intently gazing at the passing clouds. The afternoon light cast a warm halo over her hair. He took a deep breath, taking a small navy velvet box from his suit pocket. Lily. The girl turned back her round eyes, curious. "I have something for you." Arthur held out the box. It was not the old cracked plastic food container Lily once treasured. This was a new, delicate and formal box. Lily took it, her small hand carefully opening the lid. Inside, resting on the soft velvet lining, was a simple yet elegant silver necklace. The pendant was heart-shaped. "Open it," Arthur said softly. Lily gently pried open the latch with her fingernail. The heart pendant flipped open. Inside were two tiny, neatly cut photos. On the left was Sarah smiling brightly in the sun. On the right was Arthur holding Lily the day she left the hospital, his eyes looking at her with tenderness. Lily stared intently at the picture of her mother. She ran her finger over Sarah's face, then looked at the picture of her father. Her eyes were moist. She looked up at Arthur, smiling. That smile resembled Sarah's so much it made Arthur's heart skip a beat. Mom was right. Right about what Mom said in the letter, that you would come. She said you weren't the monster Grandpa said you were. She said you were the prince. Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He shook his head, reaching out to tuck a lock of hair behind his daughter's ear. "No, my daughter. I am not the prince. In this story, I was just someone isolated in the icy tower." He looked deeply into her eyes, his voice low, full of gratitude and sincerity. "You are the hero. You came and rescued me. Without you, I would have slowly faded in that winter." Lily tilted her head in thought for a moment, then she grinned, revealing her adorable missing tooth. She leaned forward, wrapping her arms tightly around Arthur's neck. "Then the hero loves Dad the most in the world." Arthur held the girl close. He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the small body, the scent of baby wash, and the smell of sun in her hair. His heart, once a perpetual block of ice, was now beating strong, warm, and full of life. Outside the window, the sun had set behind the skyscrapers, but the city did not darken. Millions of lights began to turn on, sparkling like falling stars. The reflection on the glass clearly showed a large man and a little girl resting their heads against each other peacefully high up in the sky. Below, New York was still bustling, noisy, and challenging. But here in this room, and most importantly, in the heart of the king of the tower, an eternal spring had truly begun. The story of Arthur and Lily, while exploring the familiar trope of the cold mogul and the lost child, still offers its own appeal through the subtle development of character psychology. What resonates most is the sharp contrast between the two worlds, one of extreme luxury but profound isolation for Arthur, and one of poverty and tragedy that still held pure, unconditional love for Lily. Arthur's journey is not just a legal battle for custody. It is fundamentally a journey of self-redemption. Small details like his awkwardness in applying a cool cloth to ease a fever, or his clumsy attempt at making porridge, humanize the image of a distant mogul, making him easy for the reader to connect with. Arthur's money was once useless against the pain of the past, but now it has become the right tool to protect the present. The ending with the image of spring returning to the concrete tower is highly symbolic. It conveys the message that no matter how powerful one is, a person only truly lives when they have a family to love and protect. Note: The story above is entirely fictional. Character names, locations, and events have been created for the purpose of educational and artistic illustration. Any resemblance to actual people or real-life events is purely coincidental.